great to be back on the campus of USAO. Good to be back in Chickasha. For some of you that are too young to remember, I actually was a television sportscaster and news anchor for a long time and covered a lot of games on this campus. And I've got to say that the uniforms your men's basketball team is wearing right now, probably the coolest uniforms in the state. I don't know who designed those. Maybe there's somebody in this room, but those are really good. And of course, your women's team is really good. I think they won 26 games the last time I looked. I thought I would spend a few minutes, really talking about my professional career, and then talk a little bit more about Oklahoma City's ascension and what I've learned along the way, and how I think that can transfer over to state government, and what lessons that we've learned in Oklahoma City that might be helpful to those who are considering their vote for the governor's race. First of all, I grew up with a very focused intention on my life. I knew I was going to be a television sportscaster, and worked extremely hard to reach that goal. I can remember how driven I was when I was in college in a must have been a sophomore class. I had this professor who kind of, I don't know why he wanted to perform this way, but he stated to the class, how many of you in here want to be a sportscaster? And a bunch of hands went up. And he says, well, I hope you got a backup plan, because only 1 out of 10 of you is ever going to make it. And I remember I looked around the room and I counted out 9 other people. I said, well, I'm going to make it. It's all I've ever wanted to do. And I was fortunate. I got a good education. I sent out 110 resumes. I got 2 answers, and one of them, my first job, was in Bryan, Texas. I was 21 years old, but a main anchor at an ABC-CBS affiliate down in Texas. Was there just less than a year, and then went to Oregon for, again, less than a year at an NBC affiliate to be the main sports anchor, and then came back to Oklahoma City, and I was, I think, 22 when I came back to Channel 5. My third job, but I was a television sportscaster, news anchor. When you're in the sports department, you kind of do everything. So you're a photographer, you write, you edit, you anchor, you report. I mean, you have to do it all, especially in those earlier days. And I wound up being there for 18 years, 15 of those years in sports, and then 3 years in news. A turning point in my life occurred when I was a news anchor. The Oklahoma City bombing had occurred. I was starting to think about what am I going to do with the second half of my professional career. And I asked my boss if they wouldn't consider allowing me to be a news anchor instead of a sports person. I was kind of evolving and changing as a person. And they were a little reluctant at first, but they eventually figured out a way to make that happen. So I was anchoring the morning news and the noon news, but in between I had this window, and I asked for a beat so I could go out and cover something. And I went into my boss's office and I explained to her why I should go cover the state legislature. And I gave it my most convincing pitch. And she listened, and then she said, I want you to go cover City Hall. I thought, what did I do wrong? Why was I being punished? I wasn't exactly sure where City Hall was. I went out to the assignment desk, explained to one of my friends who was on the desk that I was this new City Hall reporter, and went down and covered City Hall. And a most dramatic thing occurred. I walked into the council chambers. I didn't even know where the media was supposed to sit. There's a defined area where the media is supposed to sit. I didn't know that, so I just sat out where the audience was supposed to sit, and I could see all the eyes on the council. They all wondered what I was doing there. I think most of them thought I was still a sportscaster and couldn't figure out why I was even in the room. And in the next hour of that first meeting, I fell in love with local government. And what I liked about it was the idea of elected officials standing 10 feet in front of the people that had elected them, and they were pleading their case. And I looked, and it started crystallizing what I was really looking for. I was looking for relevance. I was looking to make a difference in my community, and I realized that local government was where a person could do that. A couple of years later, I left television, started my own video production business, ran for city council, was elected. And in my first term on the city council, our mayor decided to step down and run for the U.S. Senate, and I ran for the open seat, and that was in 2004. Now, my timing was pretty good. My predecessors were extraordinarily successful at doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and Oklahoma City was really primed for success in that era, in that 2004-2005 era. we spent a lot of time working on job creation. And when you look at Oklahoma City's success story, it really is a good lesson about creating a city where people want to live. You know, Oklahoma City had gone through a while where we kept waiting for someone from the outside to come save us. When is some big company from the outside going to come in and create jobs? And we realized that, look, until we invest in ourselves, no one's going to come out and save us. We've got to invest in us first. And so we did start investing, and then the jobs slowly started percolating in the 2004, 2005, 2006 era. Now, I worked on a lot of economic development efforts in that time frame. The first was on the Oklahoma River with Dell Computers was coming to town. They were looking to site 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000. They weren't really sure at the time, but these were higher-end customer service jobs. And we were, of course, trying to develop the river. Now, our river hadn't had water very long. You know, we had this big ditch that we called the river, but by then we actually had a body of water, you know, inside, and so it was exciting for us, and we were trying to encourage development in the river, and so my pitch to Dell was, you know, was going okay, and then right as we got to the end of the thing, they wanted me to come down to Austin, so they flew me down to Austin to come to the Round Rock headquarters, and they made a very clear explanation of their approval process and their decision-making process. They said, we cannot afford to locate these jobs in a city where people might leave, not because they're dissatisfied with our company, but because they just don't like the city. We can only afford to locate in cities where people want to live. And I realized how important that place is, how important it is to have invested and have a city where you can attract highly educated 20-somethings or the type of workforce that those big companies are looking for. I remember it must have been on my birthday because they brought in a birthday cake in that July meeting. And just a few days later, we signed the papers and Dell came in and ultimately has created 2,000 tech jobs down on the Oklahoma River. I was also heavily involved in the recruitment of Boeing and most importantly, the employees who would fill the jobs that Boeing was bringing to Oklahoma City. Boeing was phasing out facilities and efforts in Long Beach and Seattle and Wichita over a few years. And each time they were bringing engineering jobs to Oklahoma City. These were the type of aviation jobs that we in Oklahoma City had been searching for a long, long time. We'd been trying to diversify away from oil and gas and investing in the aviation side of the job sector. And my assignment was a little bit daunting at first. Boeing had determined that the jobs were leaving those other cities. They sent me and a handful of others in to talk the engineers that held those jobs to move to Oklahoma City with their job. So you can imagine that first assignment going into Southern California to engineers who worked near Los Angeles in Long Beach and implying that their best future is going to be to move to Oklahoma City. And I can remember that, you know, these are, you know, generally in their late 20s and 30s. They would bring their parents, they would bring their grandparents, and they would all gather to watch the slideshow presentation that we had created that explained the benefits of working in Oklahoma and living in Oklahoma. Things like a low cost of living, things like a lack of traffic congestion, things like an abundance of fresh water and clean air. If you're on the east or west coast, these are not amenities that you take for granted. We tend to take them for granted in Oklahoma, but these are very important opportunities for people in other parts of the country to come enjoy. We more than doubled Boeing's expectation on the number of people that would come and come along with their job. And we did a similar thing in Seattle and then similar thing in Wichita. It was a little bit of a different sell in Wichita because that population had been to Oklahoma City. It was not sight unseen like it had been for the first two. Since I was elected mayor, we, and I say collectively we because it is a team effort in Oklahoma City on job creation, we've collected nearly 100,000 new jobs and nearly 10,000 new businesses have begun. And it really gets back to what my predecessors learned the hard way, and that is you've got to invest in yourself. So fast forward and the opportunity here of running for governor, I don't know that you're going to find a person that has seen more of our state highways than my wife and I have over the last 7-8 months. I guess we've seen them all. We've already had a campaign event in all 77 counties and been to a lot of places multiple times. And I've seen in most of the state that the surface of the highways is actually probably better than I thought it would be. I must have had low expectations, but the surfacing, I was overall satisfied, but there were parts of the state that you could tell had deferred maintenance and hadn't been taken care of. And I tried to imagine in those situations, how am I going to bring in a job creator? How am I going to bring in an outside investor and imply to them that I want them to invest in this part of Oklahoma when we haven't invested in Oklahoma? I know that's not going to happen. They're not going to come in and save us. If we don't invest first, they're not going to come in and invest later. And so infrastructure is extremely important. We also got to invest in the citizens of this state. And that includes a couple of barometers, actually 3 I want to talk about. First, health and education. When I look at the state of Oklahoma and try to search for the reasons why we've never really been able to grasp that continual, sustainable trajectory of an economy that we all know that we're capable of, I think it's because we've allowed our standards in health and education to slip through the years. We've got to understand how important those components are. And a lot of health and education falls onto the shoulders of the individuals. For the most part, a person's health is determined by things that they do, or their actions. For the most part, a person's education is the result of what they've chosen to do, how they've aspired to achieve a higher level of education or not. And we have got to have a culture in this state that values health and education. We've got to continue to communicate to the next generation that these are very important things. And we've got to raise the standards of what it means to be an Oklahoman in those areas. Another area that has to do with the humanized area of this state, and that is criminal justice reform. We've got to understand that we're heading in the wrong direction. We incarcerate more women than any state in the country. It looks like we're trying to be number 1 in men, but we're not quite there yet. But we have way too many people incarcerated. It's expensive. We're not doing a good job on recidivism. On the healthcare side of criminal justice, we're spending $100 million a year on health care for inmates. Now think about that. If you want a good health care program, you just need to get in our penal system. The copay is really low when you're in prison. And we're paying that. $100 million, that's $100 million we could be spending on a lot of other things. Our recidivism rate is embarrassing. If a kid drops out of an Oklahoma high school, there's a good chance that kid's not going back. If a person gets out of an Oklahoma prison, a good chance they are going back. It's the idea of putting a person into prison. Who are they going to socialize while they're in prison? What skills are they developing? And how ready are they for a better path when they get out of prison? In most cases, we're failing on that issue. I'm not saying there's not some success stories. There are. And we ought to praise God every time we hear one of those success stories. But there's not enough. And if we're going to incarcerate someone for the purpose of punishing them, we owe them some sort of opportunity to come out a better person on the other side. A lot of people are suffering from addiction, and we're not providing the services necessary to improve that person's shot on life. In 2009, I decided that I was going to go back and seek a higher degree, and as you heard in my bio, I pursued an executive MBA at New York University. Now, there weren't any executive MBA programs in the state of Oklahoma, so I started looking around at the top executive MBA programs in the country and chose NYU. And so for 45 weekends over a 2-year period, I flew to New York. to pursue this business degree. And along the way, I realized the advantages and the opportunity and how I grew as a person through that experience. I think it's reminded me just how important lifelong learning is. And I know there are some of the audience are students, probably in your 20s, and you're getting your undergraduate degree. I could have told you with a high level of certainty when I was in my 20s and getting out of the University of Oklahoma that I was never going to school again. I was done. And I couldn't wait to get to work. Remember, I was driven. I knew what I wanted to do with my career, and I couldn't wait to get out of school. School was just to lead me to that profession that I was seeking. And then I got in my 50s and I realized my degree was a little outdated. I was no longer really interested in that vocation, and I really needed to do something to provide me with a better skill set for whatever might lie ahead. And it reminded me of a story from my childhood. My parents were middle class. We grew up in the suburbs of Oklahoma City. And in the late 1960s, my parents invested in the technology of the day. They bought an extension phone for the wall in their bedroom. All right, so, and this was so futuristic that when I had friends over to play, I would take them into my parents' bedroom to show them the extension phone on the wall. And we would pick it up and listen, and there was a dial tone in the background, so it really wasn't a good way to communicate. But nonetheless, it just all seems like we were in the early days Star Wars. We were astronauts. There's something so exciting that this technology that we were a part of was so exciting. Well, fast forward 45, almost 50 years, my mother passed away about 3 or 4 years ago. And we decided to sell her house. And so I remember walking through the home for what turned out to be the final time. And you can imagine all the memories that were coming back through my life, the home that I'd grown up in and that she'd lived most of her life in. And I saw that phone on the wall. So I walked over and I picked it up and I listened. And there was a dial tone on that phone. Nearly 50 years later, that phone was still working. And then I remembered I had a phone in my pocket that was 2 years old, and I knew I needed to get a new one. And I was thinking to myself, we've reached a stage in technology where you have got to keep learning. Your phone isn't going to last 45 or 50 years. You always feel like you got to get a new one when it's just 2 or 3 or 4 years old. And I want to use that as an example because we need to become a state that understands the learning process never stops. It didn't like what I thought when I got out of college in my 20s that I was done learning. Now, you don't have to have a formal education the way I saw it, but you've got to be in the process of remembering that you've got to keep learning. There's online learning, there's career tech, there's 2-year schools, there's 4-year schools, there's lots of traditional learning out there, but there's also just other learning through books, through a library system, through a lot of other techniques. But if we can become a state that understands that learning is for your entire life, we can really improve ourselves as a workforce. We can really separate ourselves from other societies that haven't quite figured that out. That education goes far beyond that traditional spectrum. But going forward, it is going to require that. We're going to have to keep learning. First of all, I have a lot of experience on government budgets. I've been the mayor for 14 years. I was on city council 3 years before that, so that's 17 years of being part of a budgetary process. And I will say up front, there are standardized ways to engage in a government budgetary process, and what you see at the state level does not fall into those guidelines. At the city level, we have a very transparent process. All of the elected officials are involved. Staff is given specific direction. We have developed a system through the years where we have earned the highest bond rating the rating agencies will allow a municipality to have. We have a 15% rainy day fund for an emergency situation. And contrast that to the state level where they just recently got their rating downgraded, and the rating agencies said, if Oklahoma doesn't get its act together, they're going to downgrade us again. And when you get your bond rating downgraded every time, your interest rate goes up. Your line of credit is decreased, and it costs us money. We get less out of our tax dollars. And so having a budgetary system that people can believe in and have confidence in is extremely important. The other aspect that I'll discuss at the state level is that it seems as if the most important items on the state agenda get dealt with at the very last moment. They have a deadline date where they have to meet it, and I guess we have one at the city level too, but I can't ever remember that we had to have a date to have to deal with any issue at a budget deadline, because we actually complete ours 2 to 4 weeks ahead of time so people can come look at it. And if they want to comment, they're given an opportunity to comment on the budget process and how the budget's looked at. But at the state level, it almost seems like you're just, at the end of the session, there's this emergency. And that the budget is presented. And I've had state legislators contact me about that process. And what really frustrates the ones that I'm speaking of here is that they feel like they've got to go out and defend a budget that they really didn't have much input into. They got to go home. They got to answer questions about it. And so they resent not being part of the process. And their question for me is that going to be the case? Are you going to be able to listen to the entire legislature? And of course, that's what I'm typically used to. I should also point out that they're dealing with revenue shortfalls. Well, at the city level, there's been several times over the years where the revenue that we expected to come in has not come in. And we've had to deal with putting in a hiring freeze or figuring out how we're going to reduce expenses. You've got to get on those things early. Government expenses are generally driven by personnel. And so one of the fastest ways to start reducing your costs is to put in a hiring freeze or figuring out ways that you can do more with less. In my television career, I started in 1981, just about the time cable television was starting to have a significant impact into the Oklahoma City media market. Cable started picking up a percentage every year I was in television. So the reality was that television audiences, broadcast television audiences, got smaller every year. And what you look at today, have you ever noticed how much inventory, how many different newscasts there are today compared to when I started in 1981? Well, they've had to create more inventory, right? Create more television shows, and they're doing it with fewer people. They're doing more with less, just like the private sector has been doing all along. Government's not good at doing more with less, but we have done it at the city level. We've expanded about 150,000 people in Oklahoma cities since, say, the 2000 census. And there might be a slight uptick in the number of personnel under city, but it's very slight. But think of all the people we've added. That's about a 25% increase in population with pretty much the same size staffing. We're doing more with less. That's what we did in the private sector when I was in broadcasting. That's what we've done at City Hall in Oklahoma City. And I'm having trouble seeing state government come up with the same level of efficiencies that I've experienced at those other levels. Now, maybe I'm wrong, maybe they've been doing efficiencies, there's a lot of agencies out there, but my perception is that that same level of doing more with less has not been enacted. Raising the standards for health and education are my top priorities. We've got to do better in education. My mother was a first grade teacher for 35 years. I would like to see teacher salaries improved to the regional average as soon as possible, as soon as we can realistically get them there. I would also like to see STEM teachers paid more. I think we've got to realize that we're going to have to compete with the private sector for the best instructors for our kids. We've also got to invest in higher ed. Now, the agencies that run these departments also have to be looking to reinvent themselves. We're dealing with outdated models at certainly the K through 12 level. And I don't know that we've seen the type of attention to change at the higher ed level that I'd like to see. I'm inspired that higher ed is at least looking at itself and examining itself about the type of efficiencies that they might be able to put into the system. I think that's wise because, you know, one of two things is going to happen. You're either going to help design a better system for yourself, or the legislature is going to do it for you. And I would think you'd much better off trying to be in control of your own destiny. I favor local government making its own decisions where possible. At the education level, I believe in empowering school boards. I understand there's been some issues recently at Chickasha, at the school board level, and there's dissension about the best case scenario and activities that have taken place. I don't know enough about it to have an opinion, but I know there's been talk and controversy about it. But I would like to see us, you know, make some drastic changes inside education. And I can't tell you today that I know what that looks like, and it's going to be really hard, but I like doing hard things. I would be disappointed in myself if I'm elected governor and I look back at my tenure in the office and we didn't take some significant steps to modernize some of these agencies that we rely on for state services. Education's obviously the largest and the one that's probably most primed for some redesign. None of that is going to be easy, but I would like to take on some aspects of education. And when I do that, I would love to know that there's going to be a lot of people in Oklahoma who are behind me, because that's going to be some of the more controversial things that you can touch on. But some updating, some modernization into our education system is important. I sometimes get asked in rural settings about consolidation. And you know, one of my mottos is that nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And Oklahoma is not ready for some large-scale consolidation of its schools. Nothing wrong with advancing the conversation. Perhaps there will be a day. And for the record, I mean, I realize I'm coming in as the mayor of the largest city in the state. We've got 24 school districts in Oklahoma City. And if we were really going to be serious about consolidation, that's probably where we ought to start. I've got school districts inside of school districts. I mean, it's ridiculous. So, I mean, we need to look at ways to have a more efficient educational system. But I don't want people to be fearful that I'm going to come in and start some grandiose consolidation campaign, because I'm not. It plays a large role, because if economic development is really the result of the quality of life in the state has a lot to do with that, delivering the core services in health and education that I already mentioned. Now, it could be that your question is very specific about, you know, the Commerce Department or you know, selling the state. I have a lot of experience in representing Oklahoma City and by some regard the state of Oklahoma at the same time, and selling the reasons that people should create jobs and invest in Oklahoma City. And I heard today, and I haven't heard the details, but I heard today there was a metric that came out that measured the cost of living with the discretionary income or the average salary in the state, and that Oklahoma City was #1 in the country with a margin of discretionary income. And you know, if you're a business, I mean, that means that you're probably going to be able to create a pretty efficient model when you're hiring people. Or if you have a product to sell, it probably means that people are going to have discretionary income. And so, I mean, I think that's a very important model. You know, what I would like to see in the economic development side at the state level is a willingness to partner with local governments and local efforts. From my standpoint, what we see at the state level is that the state is typically trying to take rights and abilities away from local governments. We hire lobbyists in Oklahoma City, pay them about $100,000 a year to protect us from state government. Now think about that for a moment. Cities having to protect themselves from state government overreach. And it's no different. Chickasha does the same thing with its entrance into Oklahoma Municipal League. The city of Tulsa has lobbying efforts. It used to be that we were trying to look for the state's help in some things. Occasionally that happens, but generally we're playing defense. The state should be a better partner for local governments, whether it's cities or counties or school boards. We need to be working with local leadership and figuring out how state assets can be used to make life better in individual communities. State can't do it, but the state can help local governments help themselves. One of the success stories we've had in Oklahoma City is we've reduced our jail count by 1,000 people, you can imagine, in one calendar year. What we did in Oklahoma City was we looked to see what common denominator do these people have that we're putting in the county jail. And we discovered to our disappointment that really the only common denominator was they were all poor. We were just jailing poor people. And the problem was that they would have some sort of fine and they couldn't pay it, and so they don't get out of jail. And well, by then they lose their job, they become separated from their support group, typically. The social cost of that entire arrangement start adding up, and we're just adding to the problems. We have changed all that. We have hired a judge that does indigent hearings, so if a person says, I can't afford to pay, there's actually a hearing to determine if they can afford to pay. And if they can't afford to pay, we let them out, and then we start working on other ways that they can pay their debt to society, usually through community service. There's a lot of options there. But we're not going to hold somebody in jail just because they're poor. It's got to be a better answer than that. And I think what I call that is being smart on crime. And are you really trying to protect society from somebody, or are you trying to punish them? And I want to help people. Now, if someone's dangerous, they need to be separated from the rest of society. I don't think anyone would question that. But if a person has another issue, and some sort of addiction issue is probably the most prevalent reason this would come up, we got to figure out a way to help them get their life back in order. That's hard to beat an addiction. And governments, got to be better at trying to provide individual paths. Now, government's not good at individual paths. Government's good at one size fits all. These are the rules, follow them. In Oklahoma City, we've had a lot of success in working with philanthropy, faith-based organizations, and nonprofits to help us deal with some of the issues of when a person falls into that intersection of poverty and mental illness and homelessness. We tend to work with these private sector nonprofits because they seem better equipped at trying to figure out the best way to get a person back on the right path. I think what we've done in Oklahoma City is we've tried to create the elements where the private sector could grow and create jobs, realizing that a strong private sector can help fund a lot of this philanthropy and faith-based organizations and nonprofits that are better equipped to deal with all the social issues that we're dealing with. It's a work in progress and nobody's got all the answers, but I'm proud of what we've done in Oklahoma City, and I think we're heading in the right direction. Well, there are standard constitutional principles. I won't go into all of those. It seems like those are, pretty well stated, and people understand the role. But I've had a lot of success in dealing at the national level on behalf of Oklahoma City and in some cases the state of Oklahoma, but more specifically my role at the U.S. Conference of Mayors in Washington. Been a part of a lot of task force, a lot of efforts to be a part of the conversation of what the United States is trying to do to help cities and trying to help local governments. It used to be, I'm going to say 10 or 15 years ago, my perception is, it used to be that you went to your congressman and your senator to get help at the local level. And it seems to me like through the years there's been a balance, there's been a shift to where when it comes to helping local governments, the cabinet officials are becoming more and more important. And so having a relationship inside the Department of Transportation, for instance, having a relationship with people inside HUD, a lot of the discretionary decisions about those funding opportunities are coming out of those cabinet positions as opposed to the earmarks that we used to get decades ago out of our own congressional delegations. And so I have worked diligently through those channels to establish relationships inside those cabinet officials and tried to figure out ways that we can improve Oklahoma City and the state of Oklahoma through those efforts. And I would continue to do that. I've worked with the White House closely through the years, and all sorts of issues. Across the board. But President Trump placed me on an autonomous vehicles task force about a year ago, and so we're looking at how autonomous vehicles are going to impact cities. Do we need to design cities differently? Do we need to make other preparations for this era that's quickly approaching when fewer and fewer people are going to be actually controlling automobiles and trucks on our nation's highways? And I've had different roles, but at leadership positions at the federal level, and I would continue to seek those. I think you really can have great influence, and you have opportunities to meet people that can help you at the local level. So I think it's really important. Mm-hmm. I got one mattering of applause out there. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, young man.
We have a number of questions. I won't be able to get to all of them. So what I'm going to try to do is hit a few in each category. Okay. So I may not get your question, but I'm going to try to get ones that appear more often. One of them is this. You mentioned the need to modernize our education system. Could you give specific examples of what types of policies you would pursue in this area?
Yeah, I would love to if I was more exact on how I think that will turn out. I'm confident that we'll be able to find direction on that. It would have to do with technology most likely. And just when you're trying to streamline any agency or any effort, advances in technology and the ability to drive efficiencies are probably going to likely come from those areas. And any large agency, public or private, is going to have inefficiencies built in it. So I don't want to say anything that's going to sound like I'm not appreciative of the men and women that work inside these agencies. I'm sure they're working really, really hard, but we are going to have to do more with less. When you start talking specifically about health, but education too, government is not going to have enough money to do all this. The baby boom generation is going to live a long, long time, and we're going to have to figure out ways to be more efficient in the way that we deliver care in health specifically, but education too. When I was in city government, of course I still am for 6 weeks, but when you looked at the expense side, I always thought it was, if you don't look at public safety, then you're really just fooling yourself, because public safety is over 2/3 of how you spend your money. At the state level, health and education that's where the money goes. That's where you've got to concentrate your efforts on efficiency and delivering more with less. And so I'm sorry I don't have more specifics on how we would do it with education, But there's opportunities there, and I'm very confident that I'll be able to figure out something that we can put before voters or before the legislature that'll provide for a better system going forward. There's so many smart people working on these issues. You know what? Maybe this is a key point. It doesn't have to be my idea. My skill set is taking the best idea and making it happen. Sometimes that's what's missing, it's leadership. And I pride myself on being a consensus builder, a problem solver, taking an idea and finding the votes. Ideas are fine, but funded ideas, that's where you make your mark. Who can get an idea and get it funded? Yeah, that's a great example from what I was just discussing. There's a lot of ideas out there. You know, I was looking at some of the ideas that are presented for a teacher pay raise. One idea was to not charge teachers income tax. That would, you know, maybe that's a recruiting tool. Maybe we could use it. Another one was to dedicate the growth of state government revenues. Let's just dedicate the first amount, say X, the first 100 million, the first 200, whatever the number is we want. Dedicate that toward teacher salaries. Make that the priority. But I guess what I want to leave this audience as a takeaway is that regardless of the plan that you come up with, I feel like I'm the best candidate who can get that plan enacted. A plan that's just sitting on somebody's desk isn't doing any of us any good. And I'm going to judge myself on my ability to get things done. Well, you know, Oklahomans want to help people. I want to help people. To the extent that medical marijuana can help people, I'm going to be for medical marijuana. Now, there are people saying, and they've looked at this more closely than me, that there are unintended consequences to this particular bill and it's too broad and it needs to be tightened. And it's a little unclear to me whether or not the legislature could tighten that up with the passage of the vote, or if you'd have to rewrite the question. So I am for the use of medical marijuana to help people who are suffering or have loved ones that are suffering. But you've got to watch out for the unintended consequences, and if we need to tighten the bill or rewrite the bill, then maybe that's the best case. But I'm for the principle of helping people. Well, if I have a skill, it's bringing people together. But whoever wrote that question is right. Right now at the Capitol, it's all politics all the time. It's Republicans versus Democrats. It's urban versus rural. It's Oklahoma City versus Tulsa. Republicans versus Republicans. House versus Senate. And by the time all of that friction kind of plays out, generally it seems like the session's about over. And as I said earlier, they have failed in many cases to not deal with the important issues that this state needs them to deal with. And so I pride myself on being a listener and bringing people together who might not have the same view, but we can figure out a way to make it work and get a compromise and get a deal done. I've done that over and over again with my city council. I've done that over and over again to pass initiatives to make our city better. And I do think that's one of the reasons that so many people were urging me to get in this race. People look at me as a problem solver, and they look at state government as a problem. I mean, everybody ought to pay their fair share. I'm not going to get into what's the fair share of one industry tonight. But let me say this. we've got to diversify our revenue streams. We've got to be less reliant on oil and gas going forward. If people want to talk about some short-term fix, okay, but big picture, we've got to start getting into other areas and other industries. Oil and gas has reached peak employment worldwide, not just in Oklahoma. So what I'm saying by that is the number of people that are employed in oil and gas is not going to grow. We've got to start working on other industries that we think can grow. Technology, of course, aviation, we feel like we can still grow that sector. The biomedical area, I think we can still grow in that sector. But the oil and gas industry has just come so efficient. They need less people to deliver the same amount of fuel. Now, I think there will be an increased demand in oil and gas. I think you'll see long-term, probably 1%, maybe for the rest of our lives. But it's not going to be so heavily laden in occupations. We're not going to be able to create jobs at the oil and gas above what we already have. And the faster we diversify, the better off we're going to be. And it's going to help our economy immeasurably to the extent that we can let this state figure out that it's got to get its revenue from other places. I've been asking myself that all day. Well, I mean, as much as I sympathize with the plight of teachers, and remember my mother was a teacher for most of my life, this isn't in the state's best interest to strike. And certainly not in the kids' best interest. And I guess part of what my takeaway is, I'd like to think that I could have figured out a better way to get this handled already. I understand that they're desperate at this point, but that is not something I would support. As much as I support teachers, I don't support a strike. Well, let me start by the most important part of everything I say, and that is allowing you to meet my wife, Terry. Terry, will you stand up back there? Terry is from Veneta. Comes from an agricultural background up in northeastern Oklahoma, but she and I met a few years ago, and when the business leaders of the state asked us to look at this race, we spent 2 or 3 months thinking about it. We traveled throughout the state. We went to rural areas, and part of the information we needed to make a decision was, how are people going to perceive the mayor of Oklahoma City? In other words, if people in Tulsa had no interest in voting for the mayor of Oklahoma City, I needed to know it then before Terry and I entered this race. If people in rural Oklahoma had no interest in the mayor of Oklahoma City, I needed to know. And no hard feelings if that was the case. And I am amazed to report to you that we haven't seen one instance of some sort of bias against the mayor of Oklahoma City, that position. Now, there's been people that said, I don't know who it is, but if you're saying, well, I consider this person, yeah, sure, I consider. So we were, I think, impressed that there were so many people with an open mind. And I'd like to think that a lot of the things that I've learned now with 17 years of executive branch experience can translate to the state level. Clearly not everything will, but I think I've learned a lot. I have a track record that's there for everybody to examine. And you will not find 2 people who love this state more than me and Terry. I'm a 5th generation Oklahoman, the first to not be a wheat farmer. My parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents are all buried in a cemetery next to a wheat field in western Oklahoma. My great-great-grandparents are buried in western Oklahoma too, next to a different wheat field in a cemetery. So our roots go deep. I have 4 granddaughters, as I mentioned, that are 7th generation Oklahomans. And their future in this state matters a great deal to me. I want them to have all the opportunities that I've had here. And I feel like we're at a critical point. in the leadership of the state. And I think Terry and I have something to offer. Anyway, thank you all very much.